So thanks for joining today. Just a few words about REMI for those who aren't familiar. REMI is the leading firm for developing policy analysis software, especially on regional economic policy. So the models here that we provide to state and local and federal agencies are to be able to answer what-if questions about what the effect is a policy will have for the economy. And today's presentation is about talking about Biden's ambitious $2.3 trillion infrastructure plan and the role that modeling can have to make sure that these taxpayer resources are effectively used to invest in the economy and create jobs and other measures of economic performance. So as a summary, is the problem with infrastructure in the U.S. is well recognized. It's something that we encounter as individuals every single day in getting to and from one place or another and in our daily lives. From the American Society of Civil Engineers, their infrastructure report card, they say there are 56,000 structurally deficient bridges, 15,000 high hazard dams, 1 million water pipes that are over 100 years old, aging electric transmission and distribution, an $836 billion backlog of capital needs for highways. There are issues with schools, transit, solid waste, and further infrastructure repairs and improvements needed for airports, inland waterways, levees, ports, and rail. These ACSE reports have been giving very low grades for the state of U.S. infrastructure for a long time now, and this is the administration's plan is very encouraging movement towards having major federal support for supporting needed repairs and improvements. And here are just a couple of visible examples. LA1 in Louisiana, just inland from the Gulf of Mexico, and I-95 in the Pennsylvania Turnpike near Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, where improvements and further resiliency is direly needed. Okay, so infrastructure investment, fixing the potholes, fixing the bridges, the water system, the seaports, the inland waterway system, airports. Generally, people are for repairing our infrastructure and filling the potholes, repairing the bridges. But the crux of this and why the major packages seem to fail is the how to pay is unpopular. So generally speaking, Republicans are opposed to tax increases in general, whatever kind of tax increase. And we found with the infrastructure that Democrats tend to oppose flat or regressive taxes. And traditionally, infrastructure and highways have been funded by a gas tax. So when you face the opposition, both from the Republicans and the Democrats, to increasing the gas tax, then you run into a financing problem where the fuel tax has not been increased since 1993. The Federal Highway Trust Fund is being depleted, and there are also infrastructure needs that go beyond highways and roadways that aren't being fully addressed either. And I'd say, secondly, as well as sort of the political divide between Republicans and Democrats, there's generally speaking an overall I'd suggest one of the reasons that there hasn't been broad public support for increasing the gas tax and building out the highway system and other infrastructure system is somewhat of a lack of public confidence that taxes will be well spent. Like a perception that spending is driven by politics rather than in turn on investment, so that taxes go up and the typical citizen doesn't necessarily see those benefits flowing back to them personally, which is one way that economic modeling can help communicate to the public, can quantify and make tangible the jobs and the other economic benefits that come back to people from these improvements. And also within the public sector, there's sort of an inherent tension between distributing funding, so make sure that all areas are served and have access and benefit from federal funding. So rural areas and urban areas, different regions of the country, different political and socioeconomic groups within the U.S. or within a metropolitan area, and a tension between that and then also sort of making the investment like you would on a business and only placing the investments on the highest return areas. Again, economic modeling can help communicate this because sometimes projects which may look like they directly benefit a particular city, such as transportation improvements around Chicago, might be targeted on the Chicago metro area, but yet some of those benefits, economic benefits, may flow much more widely across the Midwest and the U.S. as a whole. So the importance of economic modeling comes into understand the framework and the structure of the economy and infrastructure. And in particular, what is the relationship between investment in infrastructure and jobs, economic output, income, and other economic measures. So the legal and regulatory and financing and construction system is all, very, very detailed, and modeling can really provide a framework so we understand the interaction between infrastructure improvements and economic outcomes. Secondly, it's important to move to the next step and actually quantify the benefits. So move beyond the qualitative terms. Certainly, we've heard many a politician or other government leader talk about infrastructure, the purpose of infrastructure being to create jobs, to create good, well-paid jobs. But the modeling actually quantifies this, and you can put a number on it, and you can connect the dots between what's being done at the political and legislative level and what's being done in terms of execution on the project level, to make sure that projects are well done and they actually contribute not only to short-term economic growth, but to long-term competitive and economic growth. And then finally, the communication is very important. So modeling can help communicate that even though a project may go in place in a metropolitan area, the benefits of that project may be very widely distributed throughout the entire economy, including rural areas and other areas that aren't directly where the project goes, but are very indirectly closely connected to the overall infrastructure quality in the U.S. And we know now that this is a very For those who are working with projects and working in the field, in the field, we know that this is a very pivotal moment. There's been massive federal support already through the CARES Act and the ARP, and now this pending infrastructure bill, so that the federal government in particular has been very heavily involved in providing resources to individuals, to communities, to states, to be able to address economic problems. And the question is right now, with all the federal funding that's available and potentially future funding with this pending infrastructure bill, will it be put to good use or will it be squandered? So it's a real tipping point in the decisions that states and metropolitan areas and other communities are making. Is it's a pivotal time. Do we use this fund to invest for invest wisely for a prosperous and long-lasting future, or is the funding just going to be squandered in some way, used ineffectively? So it's very critical that we evaluate the uses of this funding, quantify how it's going to impact the economy, how it's going to impact the future of a state or a metro area, because this is the chance. Economic modeling then is really used to evaluate projects, to prioritize projects. There are many potential projects out there. It's important to select the ones that are best at achieving economic and other objectives. And economic modeling also provides a formalized approach to project selection. So it could be done on measurable, quantifiable questions rather than just sort of pure political competition for resources. So it's a pivotal moment, and I would suggest that opportunity knocks but once, and here's the opportunity through the existing programs and then the pending infrastructure bill to really establish a basis at the metro level, the state level, the community level for the future. This is just a very hypothetical representation of where the analysis needs to go beyond when we're talking about transportation and jobs. And we hear this word that transportation and infrastructure investment creates jobs, creates good jobs. And the modeling, oftentimes what people are thinking about is those direct construction jobs, is you put a lot of construction workers out fixing the roads or some other type of infrastructure. And that's just this kind of the tip of the iceberg. Those are the initial construction jobs that are created by a project. But it's very important to look at the underlying improvement in competitiveness, in the long-term viability of the infrastructure project. And here we're talking about accessibility. So this is really related to transportation, is that you could look at a big construction project like the Atlanta airport as creating a lot of short-term jobs in construction, but really the power of that type of infrastructure project is the long-term competitiveness of the Atlanta metro area, which to a large extent is driven by having really good access with the airport and interrelated infrastructure and transportation systems. So the point we want to get across in the modeling is to look not only at the short-term construction effect, but to look at the long-term productivity, cost, competitiveness improvements, which will drive forward longer-term economic growth. And we can just sort of lay this out is we talk about REMI, Transite particularly is the REMI Transite model is used for transportation analysis. And this sort of shows the difference between sort of a traditional static multiplier approach, where you add construction spending, create construction jobs, and operation and maintenance spending, and then the dynamic approach, where we're not only looking at the jobs from the construction and operation and maintenance, but also the competitiveness benefit and economic benefit from travel time savings, emission savings, safety improvements, fuel expenditures, network speed improvements, access to labor, and access to intermediate endpoints. And FHWA represents Transite as among the best equipped to estimate productivity impacts. These are just a few examples of projects that we've been involved in. Projects such as the O'Hare International Airport expansion analysis, the Louisiana 1, LA 1 economic vitality analysis, Amtrak's Gateway program, which connecting Manhattan into New Jersey and used by Amtrak, as well as commuter rail lines, the Michigan 5-year transportation plan, the Upper Great Plains Transportation Institute economic impact analysis, SCAG's employment and demographic analysis and long range plan, and then Arizona as with the Interstate 11 environment and economic impact analysis. And I think that these projects really show that when we're talking about a large federal infrastructure plan, that it really comes down to the project level, what's happening in the states, in the metropolitan areas. We have a federal system of government, so implementation of any program will go down to the state and the metro area. And then also I'd say that the success of a federal infrastructure program really relies on the execution of that program, which goes down to project-specific analysis and is something that is conducted by states and metro areas. So I just wanted to sort of set the stage here for the kind of issues we're looking about and how we feel that economic modeling helps to inform the process in a very important way. And now I'd like to turn the presentation over to Xiaochu, who will be demonstrating showing a couple of applications about how infrastructure improvements affect economic activity. So over to you then.
Okay, thank you, Fred. And can you see my screen now?
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay, so now I'll start to share my screen and to show our model demo here. So before we go to see the detailed demo, I'd like to introduce our model first. So as we can see, this is a home page of our flagship model, PI Plus model. And this model has 8 BA regions. So it's a national model with 160 industries. Generally, our model can allow users to quantify the economic and demographic impacts of a policy shock or a proposed project. When we want to do this kind of simulation, we need to select proper policy variables from our model as the input to the model, and then use those inputs to shock our baseline forecast. We have already built a standard national baseline control and a standard regional baseline control in our model. But if users have different estimations about the future macroeconomic or demographic trends, they can also update on those assumptions in our model and get an alternative national baseline control and an alternative regional baseline control. And either under the standard baseline control or under an alternative baseline control, when we want to do a simulation, we can click this new regional simulation tab here. And then For example, here, I want to do a simulation under the standard regional control. I can click this standard regional control, and here click new simulation button. Then we will go to a page called select inputs. So from this page, we can select the policy variables we want to use as a model input by different methods, like we can choose the policy variables by topics or by scenarios. And another way is to click this full list button. And now we can see all the policy variables we can use as the model input. So we can find the proper policy variables we need. And then we can click the select button to further calibrate the details about this policy variable. And then after we choose those policy variable, they will be listed on this inputs list. Then we need to go to this forecast options page and choose how long we want to run this simulation. And then we can click this run forecast button to run the simulation. After a few seconds or few minutes, we can go to the result page to see the model result. And all the simulations we have run can be saved in our model. Just need to click this Save Forecast button. And all the saved simulation will be listed on this View Forecast page. So here, for example, our first scenario today is about the transportation infrastructure, and I've already run it and saved it here. We can click it and open it. So now let's start to see the detail about the first scenario. The first scenario is a national level scenario to see the big picture of how the transportation infrastructure investment will impact on the US economy. So here, according to President Biden's plan, that there will be around $621 billion investment in the transportation infrastructure and resilience over the next 8 years. And we will simulate this policy item during a study period from 2022 to 2030. And we will use 3 policy variables to simulate this policy. The first policy variable will represent the investment in transportation infrastructure. And each year, that will be 1/8 of $621 billion. So that will be around $78 billion per year. Reflected in our model, I'm using this detailed industrials policy variable for the detailed industry, transportation structures, highways, and streets, and for the whole country. And I'm using a spread feature in our model to share out the national level $78 billion per year investment across different regions in the US according to their demand. So this is the first policy variable. The second policy variable is about the labor accessibility. That's mainly because after we upgrade the transportation infrastructure, the labor accessibility will be increased. For example, people will save commute time, and it will be easier for employers and potential employees to connect to each other. But we should notice that there is a lag between the start of the investment in transportation infrastructure and the start of the increase in labor accessibility. So I will increase the labor accessibility in model gradually from 2022 to 2029. So in model, I'm using this labor access index policy variable across the whole country and increase it from 0.25% in 2022 to 1% in 2025 and keep 1% until 2029. The last policy variable is about how to fund those investments. According to Biden's administration, they propose to increase the corporate tax to cover those investments. And they estimate that the increase in the corporate tax over the next 15 years will cover the investment in the next 8 years. So here I got this number by multiply the investment each year by 8 and divide it by 15 to get this number. In model, I'm using the production cost policy variable to represent the increase in the corporate tax. And that's across the whole country. And I put the number we just got here. So this is the model input for this simulation. And then we can go to see the results. So here, this is our result page. As we can see on the left-hand side, we have different sectors. For example, in the detailed economic sectors, we can see some detailed economic result variables. For example, the output by industry, by region. And similarly, we have a section called detailed demographic. Here we can see some demographic results, for example, population or migrants by age, by race, and by gender. If we just want to get a big picture of the impacts, we can click this summary table. So here we can see on this summary table, there are some most important economic and demographic result variables here. And we can see according to our assumption and input, there are positive change compared to the baseline. That means based on our input, the positive impact of the investment in transportation infrastructure will overweight the negative impacts of the increase in corporate tax. And our model also allows users to see the results using different types of visualizations. So for example, we can see the result in line chart. So for example, this line chart is about employment and transportation. We can also go to here to choose display type. We also have bar chart, pie chart, and map. So this is about the first demo. And the first demo is a national level demo to see the big picture of how the transportation infrastructure will influence the whole economy in the US. But the final result of the transportation infrastructure investment highly depend on how we allocate those funds, how we prioritize those projects. If we can prioritize the most economically important project, we may see a more positive impact. So the second scenario is a project-specific simulation, and that's about a new Brent Spence Bridge. Brent Spence Bridge is in Cincinnati City. It's a very economically important bridge, and now it's bearing traffic which over its load. So there is a plan about building a new bridge alongside the existing one, and also making other road improvements on both sides of the Kentucky and Ohio border. This plan will cost around $2.6 billion and will finish by 2024. And our study period is from 2022 to 2030. And here the model inputs is very similar to the national one. So the first thing is to represent the investment in this bridge project. And that's 1/3 of $2.6 billion per year from 2022 to 2024. So in the model, let's see, again, I'm using this detailed industry sales policy variable for transportation structures, highways, and streets in Hamilton County, which Cincinnati City is, and put the number here. And the second group of policy variable is about accessibility. So we will increase both the labor accessibility and commodity accessibility. So the labor accessibility refers to the to the decrease in the commute time. And commodity accessibility means that the companies or factories can get to a wider range of production input or be more easily to get access to production input, which will increase their productivity. So again, we will increase those accessibility gradually. In the model for the labor accessibility, I'm using the labor access index and increase it for Ohio and for Kentucky. And for the commodity accessibility, similarly, I'm using the commodity access index policy variable in our model and improve it for Ohio and Kentucky. And they will be increased gradually from 2022 to 2030. And the last policy variable is about how to fund those projects. Again, we will use the increase in the corporate tax nationwide to fund this project. So I'm using this production cost just as the previous simulation to use the production cost increase to simulate the increase in corporate tax. So here are the inputs. And for the results, again, we can see the summary table. So here we can choose the regions. First, we can look at the Hamilton County. We can see in general, the economic impacts are very positive and similar for the rest of Ohio and for Kentucky. And if we look at the rest of the US, we can also see positive economic impacts. This means if we prioritize some most economically important project, not only the region where the project will take place will benefit from this investment, the rest of the US will also benefit from this project because of the increase in accessibility. So these are about the two transportation infrastructure scenario. Now I will turn the floor over to Julian.
Yes, thank you so much, Xiaochu. That was a lovely demonstration. I trust that everyone can see my screen. Let me know if you can't. So let's dive a little bit deeper into the American Jobs Plan that Biden has proposed. We'll talk first about the specifics of the package, and then we'll move to the economic considerations, especially how we pay for it, as well as the sort of political feasibility of it passing. That's where we'll end up. So at the highest level, the bill includes sort of multiple categories of infrastructure, right? Really calling it one infrastructure bill is a little bit of a misnomer. It's an ambitious plan. It's the greatest spending ever proposed by the United States, and Biden himself has equated it to, the push for the space race and moon landing, interstate highway network, and racial justice measures in the 1960s. He, himself again has called it a once-in-a-generation investment in America. So we can see the typical traditional infrastructure, roads and bridges, money allocated towards those types of infrastructure, as well as some specific infrastructure projects aimed at combating climate change, namely the electric vehicle charging stations, which we'll see another little scenario of later. But then there's this third category, sort of human infrastructure, and Biden and his administration is attempting to put a spin on, jobs programs and social programs that are not often associated with the more traditional understanding of infrastructure. And we'll just say, for the purpose of this webinar, we'll mostly focus on that traditional physical infrastructure because we expect to see a second package proposed soon, which Biden has hinted at being called the American Families Plan, and that will include a lot more of this type of social and jobs programs. So here's a list of what's in the plan, and I'll actually go through a even more detailed list. So Biden has promised $115 billion to physical infrastructure, which includes, repairing 20,000 roads, 10,000 bridges, either built or repaired. The plan also includes $85 billion to public transit, which, as we know, is an essential element towards combating climate change. And actually, that $85 billion doesn't include trains. There's another $80 billion just to trains, both commercial freight and passenger travel, which we know Joe Biden loves his trains. There's also $25 billion to airports, $17 billion to waterways and ports, $20 billion to improve road safety. And then we've also, we've got more of this energy infrastructure. So we're looking at $174 billion to electric vehicle incentives for both consumers and producers. Most of that's going towards building 500,000 charging stations across the nation by 2030. $50 billion to disaster resilience measures for communities most at risk to climate change, $20 billion to direct investment in the transportation industries in underserved communities, another $17 billion investing into jobs support and training for underserved communities. Part of that includes a $5 billion rural partnership program. So as Dr. Trey's talked about earlier, we're seeing ways that are trying to target typically underserved or overlooked parts of the populace. There's also a whopping $400 billion dedicated to caregiving for older and disabled Americans, mostly focused on in-home caregiving. Got $213 billion to repair and expand affordable housing, $100 billion to public schools, $25 billion to childcare, $12 billion to community college, $18 billion to veterans hospitals and other federal buildings. And we're not quite done yet. We got $100 billion to broadband, which we'll briefly talk about later too, sort of expanding this definition of what infrastructure is a little bit, but keeping it in sort of the physical realm. We've also got $100 billion to expanding the electric grid, making it more reliant on clean energy, other renewables. $66 billion dedicated to improving water systems, $45 billion to replacing lead pipes. And then we've got a lot of, other chunks between 30 and 50 billion sort of research R&D grants. So National Science Foundation, other, technological development, semiconductor industries, supply chain support, HBCUs, etc. So there's a lot of things in this bill. There's a reason why there may be so many things in this bill. It's been a long time coming. We haven't seen an infrastructure bill in a long time. And what we have seen, pretty much the everyday American does see infrastructure in disrepair. Again, as Dr. Trey's mentioned, this is an issue that's front and center on the minds of voters, on the minds of the private sector, which is beginning to call for these types of investments as well. I think they see potential for a return on investment that will benefit them as well. So the question here, kind of the crux of the matter is this the time to go big and bold? Is this the time to spend a lot of money in order to get a big investment back? Or should we continue, sort of just with the piecemeal limping along that we've been doing for a while? And I just noted two other issues that are particularly pressing. There are many to note, but the $100 billion dedicated to broadband goes to fix a pretty important issue. Involves connecting the entire country. And there's more of a general need to kind of keep up in a rapidly modernizing world. And I think that's why we're seeing a lot of investment in research and development in this proposal. And then finally, on Earth Day, it goes almost without saying, but it definitely should be said that, now is surely the time to invest in climate, and there's big potentials for money to be made in those industries if we invest. So this is a pivotal moment, as Dr. Trey has mentioned. So there are real infrastructure needs, and there are sort of these structural needs, and I literally mean structural needs: the roads, the bridges, the water pipes, the school buildings, etc. But then we're also, adding some categories of infrastructure which remain physical but are newer because they're, we're in a new world, a new century. So broadband internet is one. Looking at transportation systems, including EV, electric vehicles. And again, we've seen a lot of enthusiasm, especially in the stock market, for these types of industries, renewable industries of all kinds, semiconductors, the electric vehicle industry. I mean, we've seen in the past couple months alone, lots of major car companies, promising to go all electric by a certain date, or release new electric models, or electric trucks. I mean, this is really a kind of a boom time for that industry. We do know also that Biden is a strong supporter of research and development. He's, as we mentioned, pledged some billions of dollar grants to different organizations. So this is something that nobody can ignore, but especially federal, state, and local governments. This is just something that is happening and needs to be considered. So again, there is always a little bit of uncertainty in modeling, but especially in this sort of infrastructure or transportation modeling, there is plenty of uncertainty. And if we invest this much money, will it pay for itself? Will it get used? Those types of questions. So each project, requires its own analysis, requires unique forecasting. So that's what REMI is all about. Because we're focusing more on physical infrastructure in this webinar, let me just include 2 examples, and then we'll hop right into another brief demonstration of what it would look like to establish a network of charging stations. So first, here's an example of a project that might get a grant under this bill, the John A. Roebling Bridge, which is also actually right near the other bridge that Xiao Chu was talking about earlier. It's on the Kentucky-Ohio border. The Roebling Bridge is 155 years old. And in the last decade, it has actually closed a number of times. It closed once in 2013 after some sandstone fell off a tower, and in 2018 after a major accident, damaged some steel parts of the bridge. And actually, when the Brent Spence Bridge was closed for some renovations in November of 2020, there was so much traffic on this next door bridge, the Roebling Bridge, that they had to shut it down for a couple days because it had exceeded the weight limit. So, there are real reasons why infrastructure needs revamping all across the country. Another great example of this is electric vehicles. Again, this is a newer sort of broadening the scope a little bit of what it means to be infrastructure. This is really key to sort of unlocking the electric vehicle market. I mean, without gas stations, you can't have cars. Similarly, without electric charging stations, you can't have electric vehicles. So by engaging in such an investment, 500,000 electric vehicle charging stations by 2030, Biden is sort of eliminating the biggest impediment to where you would refuel your car, which just makes this a much more desirable product. And there's an important thing to note here, which is electric vehicles, on the whole, sort of long term, well, they're cheaper to use for the consumer. They're also cheaper to use on society. The charging stations are much easier to build than a gas station. And just overall, EVs are easier to refuel. So there's sort of a payoff down the line in productivity. And that's what the REMI models can show. It's what Dr. Trey showed earlier in that graph, right? There may be the initial jobs growth of, building these 500,000 stations, but then there's the sort of downstream effects, right? And one of those is productivity will just increase. So we'll quickly move into a demonstration of what it would look like to put electric vehicles all over the US. Here's a map of, it just is using, US Department of Energy data on how many there currently are, about 40,000 right now. Most of them are not high-speed chargers. So there are a lot of reasons why electric vehicles might be, it's a public good, right? It's putting in money, the public dollar, to give back, in a way that would benefit everyone. Again, it also eliminates the biggest barrier to entry for this market. Long term, we've talked about this a little bit. There's some increased productivity down the line. There's also, lower operations costs for the consumer, which means more consumer spending, which can, drive economic activity in other sectors. We've also talked about the jobs that will be gained in this construction. Of course, we also need to mention the jobs will be lost in the oil and gas industry as gas-powered cars decrease in popularity. But interestingly, the last bullet point, electric vehicle, we're seeing it all over the world at this point. Electric vehicles are beginning to take the world by storm. So if we can have a thriving EV market in the United States, that keeps US automakers competitive internationally as well. So I'll give it back to Xiao Chu for another quick demonstration.
Okay, thank you. Or to show my screen. Okay, so let's see the third scenario. So this scenario is about electric vehicle production and charger construction. So for the electric vehicle production, I'm just going to use the General Motors plant in Michigan as an example. So basically, General Motors will convert an aging Detroit assembly plant into the manufacturing heart of its all-electric future and create 2,200 jobs. And for the chargers part, I'm going to simulate President Biden's plan to build a national network of 500,000 electric vehicle chargers by 2030. To do so, I'm going to use another model that's called E3+, which is built on our PI+ model and with an add-in module about energy and environment. So with E3+, we can not only see the economic and demographic impacts, we can also see some energy-related impacts. So for the model inputs, we will have 3 groups of policy inputs. So let's see. We can go to the input list. So the first group of the policy input is about the electric vehicle production. So we will first increase the motor vehicle industry output in Michigan, and then we will also decrease the motor vehicle manufacturing industry output in the rest of the US to show a decrease in demand for the gas-powered vehicles. So here, as the data source show, there will be an increase in 2,200 employment in motor vehicle manufacturing industry in Michigan. And then if we click this magnifier button, our model can convert those increase in employment to increase in output. So here we can see the increase in output in dollars. And then we will take half of those dollar amount to decrease the output in motor vehicle manufacturing industry's output in the rest of the US. So this is shown by the second entry of the policy variable. And for the second group of the policy variable, that's about the consumer spending shift from the motor vehicle fuels to electricity because of the use of electricity vehicle. So here we are going to use the consumer spending policy variable. So first, we will decrease the motor vehicle fuels across the US. And then we will increase the consumer spending in electricity across the US for the same amount. I mean, it's not the same dollars amount. It's just an equivalent conversion. And because to charge an electric vehicle generally is cheaper than charging a gas-powered motor vehicle. So consumers will save money from this consumer spending shift. And we assume that consumer will spend those saved money across other commodities. So here we have another policy variable entry to share out those saved money to other commodities. And for the final group of policy variable, that's about the construction of those electrical chargers by 2030. And according to a research report, the cost is at least $5 billion. And we also assume that will be funded by the corporate tax increase. So here, to represent the construction of the charge station, we will use this detailed industry sales policy variable for power and communication structures across the US. And to share out those $5 billion investment across the US and over the 9-time period from 2022 to 2030. And then again, we will increase the production cost to represent the increase in corporate tax. So here are the inputs, and for the results, as I've said, we can also see some energy-related results in our E3+ model. So for example, here we can see there are some energy consumption for our regions, which means the US. And we can see the total energy consumption is decreased, and the decrease is mainly from the transportation sector. And similarly, for the carbon dioxide emission, we can see that the carbon dioxide emission will also decrease in the US. And that decrease is mainly from the transportation sector because the electric vehicle is more environmental friendly. And then we can also see the summary table. And here we can use the Michigan state as an example to see the economic impacts. So here, as we can see, the economic impacts is positive. That's mainly because there will be more electric vehicles produced in Michigan state, and there will also be construction of charger stations. Okay, so that's the third scenario. Now I'll turn the floor over to Julian.
Thank you. That was really fascinating to see. I will share my screen again. Okay, so we're gonna come to a close soon, and we'll leave a couple minutes for questions at the end, but I wanted to just talk about the possibility that this bill becomes law. So we'll talk first about how it's been received, and we'll talk about the economics and politics of whether it'll get passed. So there have been a number of polls done, and as you can see, they show slightly different results, but it ranges around 50%, roughly half of Americans support the bill. However, when you poll each line item of the bill separately, they poll much better than the entire bill together, which is maybe a little bit understandable. There's a lot in it, but if you poll fixing bridges and roads, that's 87% of the public supports that. Investing in caregiving, 82% support that. Wanting broadband access, 78% support that. Here's just a glimpse of one poll from the New York Times. And the sort of underlying question that Dr. Trace highlighted at the beginning of this presentation is, how well do the American people trust their government to invest the money? I mean, infrastructure is always popular, but paying for it is much less popular. It's sometimes hard to see that return on investment when it comes. So let's also talk a little bit about the corporate reception of the bill. So the private industry has certainly had something to say about this bill. Some companies are already mobilizing and lobbying to resist any raise to the corporate tax rate, which was just lowered dramatically by the Trump administration in 2017 from 35% down to 21%. Biden is proposing raising it back to 28%. Corporations, as you might guess, in the oil and gas industry, also the RATE coalition, which includes FedEx, Capital One, Lockheed Martin, Toyota, a bunch of other companies. Business Roundtable includes a number of companies. These types of industries are, for the most part, opposed to corporate tax increase. However, there have been some companies recently that have come out, including Amazon, Facebook, Google, Uber, and a number of others, coming out in support of the plan and actually in support of a corporate tax rate increase. They've said, we are okay with this. And often it's a cost-benefit analysis for these companies. They may see a bigger return on investment from infrastructure, right? They will benefit from better infrastructure and higher productivity and more consumer spending too. JP Morgan also, good to mention that they are advocating for a higher US corporate tax rate to match the corporate tax rates elsewhere in the world. And this is also a bigger trend, actually, that we're seeing of private companies, publicly, sort of open letters, publicly advocating to President Biden to be bolder even than he's being, or to take bigger steps. We saw it with the summit that's going on, I think, as we speak, the climate summit, where a number of corporations were urging Biden to be more ambitious and enact policies that may even harm some of these corporations in the short run, but have major long-term gains. So that's a very interesting trend that we're seeing. Okay, well, we need to talk about it a little bit. We've bounced around it before, but again, Biden is going to increase the corporate tax rate. There are major questions of whether this will harm the economy in the short run if corporations can spend less money. But that's not the only way Biden's going to pay for it. He's also proposed closing tax loopholes, many different kinds of loopholes, especially loopholes on real estate, pass-through businesses, which are only as passing through as you might imagine. Big banks, closing loopholes on them, as well as even some new tax penalties on the pharmaceutical industry. He's even proposed the idea of a global tax rate. Janet Yellen has also voiced this as a possibility for any US companies that are manufacturing abroad. There are two things that we wanted to mention that aren't being discussed, which could be alternatives. The first is a gas tax or any other user fee, tolls, etc. These types of things that charge based on how much you use it rather than a blanket fee on all corporations, for example. And another notably absent way to pay for it is a carbon tax, which both Biden and Janet Yellen have said they would support. Even some oil companies have come out in support of this recently. Remy did a very interesting study with Citizens Climate Lobby a while ago on the impacts of that. Done a number of studies on carbon taxes, but this is not something that Biden has proposed to pay for this. Instead, he's going with corporate tax rate. And again, we've hinted at this a little bit, but it's important to talk, whenever you're talking about infrastructure, where will the returns be, especially for a bill this big. If we're going to invest this much money, we need to be sure that it'll pay for itself, which is why modeling is so important. So Mitch McConnell, Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell, as well as House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy, have both called the bill a Trojan horse, sort of implying that it is packaged as an infrastructure bill, but actually lets in all these other liberal policy priorities. Some on the left have called the bill too, they haven't used these exact words, but too Spartan, not big enough. We actually may need even bigger investment in order to get a return. So these are the questions that you can't really answer without modeling. Wanted to briefly talk about this sort of dynamic storing. Rather than cutting taxes to boost revenues, as you often do, Biden's proposing we boost revenue, increase economic activity by borrowing a lot of money, the federal government borrowing a lot of money. And Dr. Trey has highlighted this before, but we wanted to mention two of our models, the Translite model and the tax policy model, which were used in Louisiana to show that investing in LA1 infrastructure, improvements, renovations will actually pay for itself because of the increased tax revenue that the project brings around in the long run. Okay, so we're coming to the conclusion of the presentation here. I just wanted to speculate a little bit on, what's the political feasibility of this bill. So really the only way that this bill can conceivably be passed is through budget reconciliation, where in the Senate the Democrats only need a simple majority, not 60 votes, unless Democrats somehow scrap the filibuster, and we don't need to get into that now. But whether or not the bill can qualify as budget reconciliation pretty much comes down to one person, the Senate parliamentarian. Budget reconciliation was a process created in the 1970s to make it easier to pass budgets and reduce the deficit and the other things that needed a more timely response. And the parliamentarian, she gets to decide whether the bill can proceed as Biden first introduced it, or whether it needs to be cut in some ways, trimmed down, because some parts of the bill might not qualify under budget reconciliation. So these are questions that are really up in the air and will remain to be seen in the next couple months. Nancy Pelosi has said that the Democrats would love to pass the bill by July 4th, or at least end of July. There's a September 30 deadline to pass this bill, which has something to do with the, let me get this exactly right. The bill is based off of the Fixing America's Surface Transportation Act, the FAST Act, which was authorized in 2016, and it's a 5-year act. It was extended through September 30, 2021, and the bill needs to be passed before then. So, what have we learned in this webinar? Well, we wanted to say yet again, there is a real need for investment in infrastructure. It's pretty much general consensus now between private sector, public sector, and just individual citizens that this is something that needs to be done in this country. Hasn't been done, in a real way in decades. However, really to determine whether or not the plan will be successful if it passes as Biden has proposed it, depends on just how the funds are used, how they're allocated, how they are implemented, what the projects will look like, and what the specific returns on investment will be of each of those projects. So really, to sort of spin it on at least some of the folks who are watching this webinar, the responsibility kind of lies with you all, or at least lies with state and local government officials who are putting in place these projects. You all really determine whether or not the money will be well spent. But as we said before, this is a bold plan. It's an open question whether or not it will succeed. We will all see in the coming months. And we just wanted to again remind you that modeling really is an essential part of this discussion. We can't answer these questions without economic forecasting. Modeling can let you clarify a complex policy solution and pick it apart, highlight the connections between those parts, and also calculate the quantitative hard data. And it really helps communicate better to stakeholders, to policymakers, to the public, to really bring that economic impact argument